Hey everyone, and welcome to my Procreate demo for the piece I call... Alright, that's enough. For the piece I call Kefka. Now, I'm sure everybody knows this guy, and if you don't know who this guy is, then that probably means you haven't played Final Fantasy VI. Well, actually, it guarantees you haven't played Final Fantasy VI because he's sort of the main dude, the main bad guy. But anyways, this is Kefka, and I originally did this a while ago. This has been the theme of the last few Procreate videos. I originally did this drawing a while ago, like 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, when I was doing a bunch of the Final Fantasy VI characters just in these quick headshots. And so when I finally got around to coloring him, because I reposted the sketch the other day and a lot of people thought that coloring him would probably be a good idea, I thought, let's do this a little bit differently this time. Let's use the brush pen and just re-ink the whole thing in a super clean style, and then when I get to the actual coloring, I'll actually do color holds on the lines and make sure that the lines are absorbing the color from underneath. So this is going to be bringing out some skills that I haven't employed in quite some time, and on top of that, skills that are much easier to do in Photoshop than they are in Procreate. So I don't really recommend this, but it was fun to do, so I would just never recommend it if you were under a time pressure or something like that. So what we've got here is brush pen inking, and then when I'm done with all of this stuff, it's going to go into the flatting process, which is fairly complex because the lines are going to be set to overlay, which means they're pulling a ton of color from underneath, which is a lot different than multiply, where the lines are actually affecting things quite a bit more than they are being influenced. So anyways, I'm talking over this section quite a bit because it's fairly straightforward. If you've already got Procreate, just load up the brush pen and try it out for a little bit, and you'll see what goes into doing this. It's really just about getting used to the way that tool works and doing with it what you hope to be doing with it. So that's all this part is, and I'm following the original ink drawing that I had done, because the original drawing was in ballpoint, and now I'm going for a much more precise pen type. Kefka has had quite a lot of different looks, and depending on like who's drawing him or how the person feels when they're drawing him, and so this one is largely modeled off of the most recent sort of official version of Kefka, the one that they used in Dissidia. The reason I say official is because it's the most recent and because it's the cleanest, because the original artist who designed Kefka, or at least if he wasn't the designer, he's definitely the one who's most drawn him the most in terms of if you wanted to look up Kefka, is Yoshitaka Amano, and he has a very loose style that leaves a lot up to interpretation. So when you're trying to do something really specific like this, like a reinterpretation with a fairly straightforward, solid look, you're looking for specifics, you're desperate for specifics. So the newest version that they used in Dissidia is really helpful for trying to determine a lot of these things. Also, he's just sort of got like a lot of random adornments and a lot of bullshit, and he actually sort of expands much bigger out of the frame, and I took a couple of shortcuts when I did the original drawing, and then when I was in the middle of doing this inking, I just really wanted to make sure I was getting to the color part, so I didn't really embellish it much more beyond that. As far as my inking choices through this, I was going for black solid ink. I wasn't going to try and I wasn't gonna let the colors do a lot of the talking here. I was gonna let the ink do a lot of the talking, so much so that I'll even use the ink in order to do a shadow that I know is later going to get colorized as a darker version of the color that's colorizing it. So the remainder of this color process, or this drawing process, is basically just me going in and in a sort of straightforward way, just embracing the brush and replicating the original lines. And this is what the line looked like when that was all said and done. And now we're going to move into the coloring process. So here we start by flatting with the skin first, just because it was a place to start. It sort of takes up the most real estate other than his big ridiculous collar. And so I just do it by being super precise in the flatting. So what I'm doing is I'm flatting it in a normal way, but then so that I make sure that that flat goes all the way to the edge of the line, the last step is I'm selecting the line layer and then painting in so that the flat goes all the way to the edge of that line. It's not super hard, it just takes time, and you have to make sure that you're always taking that into account while you're doing it. So the whole layer stack becomes really important too, because like for instance where that ear is, where his big pointy ear overlaps his hair, do I want the hair to be the one that's influencing the line, or do I want the ear? Well, in that case it's fairly simple, but if two things sort of meet equally on the line, which one gets the line? That's sort of the hardest part. So right now the lines are just set to overlay and they are black, and then the spit is on its own layer because I know I'm going to do this with it, which is where I'm just going to make it spit. So I colored those lines white, and then I lowered the opacity of the actual spit flat that's in there. Then once I had all of this done, theoretically if I was super tight on my flats, I should be able to do select paint, select clear easily. Now you can see here I go through quite the identity crisis with what color the shadow is going to be and what color the background is, and am I actually going to try and put them in an environment, or am I just going to keep this ethereal? Ultimately it ends up going with just sort of a, hey, this color sort of feels right kind of background, and then I end up altering the shadow layer in order to meet that. So because this art style that I'm going with here is fairly artificial in the sense that it feels really flat and cartoony and all of that, I was really struggling with like, how do I represent certain materials, what's too far. Obviously I could make the gold on that little thing in his hair look super gold, but is that really going to do well within this overall art style? That's sort of what I'm trying to figure out as I'm going through this entire thing. Plus I'm starting to wonder, oh shit, is this the right color layer for the shadows? Because I'm not super into it, but these are all just sort of the things running through my head. There you can see is my first shadow color change. I go to something that's a little bit more of a pink shadow, a very, very light purpley pink shadow. And then I start changing the background and monkeying around with like, what if I change the background to something like this? And so this is just sort of the natural process, and I will admit it's one of those pieces that in the middle of it I was like, oh shit, am I gonna totally lose interest in this? But then I ended up finding something that I really liked about it, and I kept going with it. I think Kefka is just so much fun to draw. I mean, the guy's a maniac and he's hilarious and he's got that laugh and all that. I mean, he's like Final Fantasy's Joker, except that he becomes a god, you know, although I think there's some weird Joker story where he did something like that. Who knows? Anyways, point is, so he's just so fun. I wanted to make sure that I finished it because I knew that if I could just get to the end, that this would end up being something just really fun. So now I'm on the mouth. Again, just going through select paint, select clear, making sure that I'm being sort of disciplined about that, because then I know the layer will clear the things. It'll clear the shadow layers that are in the way as I'm going. Now here's a bunch of little color tweaks. You can see the teeth got brighter and the makeup ended up getting like a blur to it, because I'm starting to try and put in some like finish quality stuff here to really wrap it up. I employ a texture, I believe, at one point fairly lightly across the entire thing. And see, there I'm going back in with the brush pen and adding in those shadows and the jewels in the back, but I'm keeping the same brush style that the rest of it was in, because that to me felt like a very important aspect of pulling off the look and feel of this entire thing. Here we go with some shines, and then I'm putting some reflections in his eyes. And now I'm just taking that background and I'm making that influence him and setting it to multiply so that he's starting to really feel anchored in that environment that's around him. That was my last, I believe, shadow change, and I started to put the bounce light in from like the collar and a couple of other little places, and now I'm using that same brush pen to put in the rim light, because I thought that that would be like a good way to do the rim light. It would echo the lines, it would feel nice and crisp, and then I use the eraser every now and then to sort of soften it where I feel like it would just benefit from a little bit of softening in order to capture the dimension that I'm going for. I didn't go for super realistic in terms of trying to catch certain bounces. Really, if I was getting anal about it, I would. But really, the way that I wanted this to come off was that it felt refined and that there were a lot of deliberate decisions made, but that it also needed to feel like a little bit on the quick side too. And ultimately, this piece was quick to do. Certainly, the coloring, once I was getting to the shadow stuff, was quick, because whenever I'm doing flats with a shadow layer, that's the quickest way that I can usually color, but I really kind of wanted it to feel a little effortless and not overworked. That said, I'm not saying I did it, but that's at least what I was going for. So now we get a little bit of the final layer effects. That's what popped in there. I put a little bit of a vignette, a little bit of a texture, some glisten in the eyes that's on the topmost layer, and now I'm going in and throwing in the last bits of that rim light, and then I start working on the final details like the spit. That's what I was just going to say. There's the spit right there. Just putting it in as a solid layer that is lowered in opacity, that has the white. I'm using a white line then to outline it so that it gets the same look as the spit that's flying through the air, and then just sort of knocking back certain aspects because it's in his mouth, so I want to make sure that it doesn't push too far forward in the entire thing. I mean, really, my absolute most favorite thing to probably draw on the planet is spit when somebody's yelling or laughing. So this is just me at this point having fun, regardless of whether or not it's good for the piece. I'll be honest, I don't know what part's being done here now. Okay, there's the rim light on the neck, and these are just sort of like the last little quick tweaks here and there to make sure that it's something that I'm absolutely in love with. You can see there some extra bounce and some extra tweaks, and then I blur all of the outside edges and sharpen the inside, and that sort of gives it that general look and feel. So I really hope you dug it. This was really fun to do, and I promise I won't do the Kefka laugh again. Thanks for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing if you really dug it. And if you're looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you can find me.